welcome to the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. We are in episode 73 together. This week's reading, we're going to be in 1 Samuel 6, 7, and 8. We are also going to go back to chapter 5 just briefly because we missed it last week and it all goes together. We're also going to be in reading of Psalm 73, and we're going to be in John 6 this week. And John 6 is going to be so good.
A lot of verses. Good. I think we're up to 60-something verses in John 6.
It's a lot of verses.
I'm like, how do we cover all this?
We won't. We will not cover it all. It's interesting. We talked about in John, we're going to have 7 miracles and we're going to have 7 I am statements. We get 2 in this week.
Yeah. Actually, we get 2 signs and an I am statement.
That's right. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah,
awesome. Is. But first, I just want to make everyone aware that it is summer. Yeah. And with summer and with my kids being home and just some vacations that we both have, families have planned, we just made a decision that we are just going to take a little bit of break for the summer. So you guys are going to continue. We're going to continue reading through the well. We just won't be able to do the weekly podcast just for June and July. We will jump back right in that second week in August. So y'all's readings is for August 7th through the 12th. We will be able to do the podcast for that week's readings.
I think we'll be starting 2 Samuel right about then.
Yeah, it was 2 Samuel chapter 2, I believe, is where we jump back into.
And, we might as well cover 1 at that point,
We probably will. So, just do an intro.
I think we'll miss we'll definitely miss, 7 or 8 chapters of John. So John is thick. Just keep going at it. I may post some things, either written or short video clips along the way if I'm so moved, if I have time. Maybe you'll do the same or not, but we'll see. We'll see where the Spirit leads us. But definitely won't be having the regularly scheduled podcast that we've faithfully been able to drop for, 73 weeks in a row now.
73 weeks in a row.
After a year and a half, it's time for a sabbatical of sorts.
I think we'll come back refreshed with even better. It's going to be even better when we come back. But keep going in the well. Yeah. Keep reading. We're going to be reading with you. We just won't be doing the weekly podcast. With that said, why don't we go ahead and jump into our readings this week? Go back to 1 Samuel. We're going to talk about 1 Samuel 5, 6, and 7 kind of as a little group. I'll let you jump in first.
Yeah. As we turn to chapter 5 and 6, and actually my notes are together with those 2 chapters because it's such a tight unit. And remember, the chapter breaks are somewhat arbitrary based on the biblical authors who wrote these didn't put these chapter breaks in. It was basically copyists and editors that were centuries later.
Right. There's a
nothing
joke.
Inspired about our chapter
breaks. Yeah. There's a joke that I've heard someone say. I can't remember who said it now. I know. Otherwise, I'd say who it was. Is that they joke that, sure, the way that these chapter breaks happened, there must have been a priest on the back of a cart headed to Rome or something, and every time they hit a pothole, they would say, oh, next chapter. Oh, next chapter. And that's how random they feel at times. Yeah. And then that person joked, I read this back in Ruth, they're like, except for they got it perfectly in Ruth.
Yeah.
Like the one time, they're exactly perfect was in Ruth. Otherwise, they seem so random.
Yep.
There you go.
That's a good story. So in chapters 5 and 6, we start to your point, you made this point before, we shift from Samuel being the main character to the ark being the focus.
Right.
And we see the ark starting to basically bring a trail of destruction to all those who want to handle it. The Philistines in chapter 4 defeated the Israelites in battle, capture the ark, and take it back to their territory.
Right, they do.
And then what do? They set it up in the temple of Dagon, or Dagon, or however you want to say, Dagon, their god. Mm-hmm. Dagon is their god, and I want to say a few words about who we think he is and who we think he was to the Philistines. But just want to give you a chance to jump in and see if you have anything to say about the fact that they have the ark now and it's in his temple.
The only thing I will say before you jump into about this temple is that throughout all of these, since 1 Samuel started and the Ark of the Covenant was talked about again, it's always said the Ark of the Lord, and every time except for when the narrator speaks, it says the Ark of God. Even when Israel is talking about it, when Israel brought it out to the battlefield, they call it the Ark of God. They don't even think it's Yahweh anymore. It's God, lowercase God, just like any other pagan god. And so that's how it's been referenced this entire time. Now, maybe you're going to talk about this slightly, but I thought it was interesting that the Ark of the Covenant was probably like knee height to adult. It's not very high. When they would walk into this temple of Dagon, the way that they their gods, they built these huge stone representations of them, and they would have been huge, like way taller than human size. And the whole point of that was for like they're over you, right?
Yeah.
And it's
If you ever seen that old movie Clash of the Titans, it's about Greek mythology and Greek gods, but it has Pegasuses and actual Greek gods who play in the movie, but they have these big characters, like one of Astarte, I believe, or Poseidon.
Yeah.
And the gods inhabit those idols. Those statues actually make them talk, but they're huge. They're like
huge.
They're like big. If you think of the Sphinx in Egypt, they're like that size.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting, when they brought the ark into this temple, which you're going to talk about in a moment, and about this god, it would have looked petite comparatively, right? It was so comparatively. And I think it's almost like this visual, like, haha, that Israel god, so tiny, right?
Yeah.
And then, but you're going to talk about it, and we talk about what God ends up doing. Not so petite after all.
That's great.
Yeah, let's go for it.
That's a great point. And it just comes to remind us that God continues to subvert the ways of the world and the wisdom of man, right?
Right. Even to the point of, like, not only is he not going to have an image, there's no image of anybody on the Ark of the Covenant, but it's also small in comparison to all these other big gods in the region, in the nations.
Yep.
Yeah.
So jumping into who Dagon was, he was obviously a deity to the Philistines, and I wanted to take a break when we talk about Dagon and just observe we've seen a continued pattern of foreign gods continuing to make appearances throughout the scriptures, right?
Yeah.
Arguably, the snake in the garden was the first appearance of maybe a god, a spiritual being, and the Hebrew word for God is Elohim, right? And so lowercase g, and so all throughout there, we get into Exodus, and God, we talked about, you especially talked about God battling the
Pharaohs.
The Pharaohs. Pharaoh was a god of Egypt, and all the other gods of Egypt that he was battling through the plagues. As we got into Joshua and the conquest and Judges, we continue to see these appearances of the various gods of the Ammonites and the Philistines coming up. So this again is a god a lowercase g, that God, capital G of the Bible, is going to do battle with. Yeah. And we're going to see that play out here in chapters 5 and 6.
So what I think I hear you saying is that although when we read we see it as a battle that happened on earth, but what you have to imagine is it literally was a battle of the spiritual realm.
Yes.
Although what we see taking place was physical items here on earth.
Yep.
You have to remember, this is a real battle in real spiritual realm happening. This is a big deal.
Right. It's literally cosmic.
Yes.
Of cosmic consequence.
Yeah.
Cosmic scale.
Yeah.
And Paul, the Apostle Paul, will talk about, can't remember the letter off the top of my head, but one of his letters talks about the powers and principalities of this world is what our fight is against. Yeah. That's literally what he's referencing.
Yeah.
So, so all that to say, Dagon was a god of the Philistines, and there's a lot that we don't know about him, but what we piece together is interesting. There used to be a view among scholars that he was a god that's somehow associated with fish.
Yeah.
That's been rejected, but and now it's generally thought that he has something to do with the grain and the grain harvest, and on one side. But then they've also, as part of the grain harvest, they found a lot of evidence around the Maeir region of Babylon, of current modern day Iraq, would have been Babylon back in the day, and that they had adopted him, the Maeir religion had adopted him as the god of corn. And so there's a lot of grain god references. And they feel like as the Philistines swept south out of the Aegean, out of the Greek area, that they would have picked up the worship of Dagon from that region. So in the Ugaritic religion, which is also north of Israel in ancient society, Dagon was the father of Baal, which we've seen make an appearance. And so we also see that Baal was a son of El in the old ancient Near East religions. So there's some confusion over was Dagon El? He might have been to some people, but he might have also been a son of Dagon or a brother. We're just not sure. So, and then we also will talk about later that when Samuel becomes a prophet, we'll talk about the Ashtoreths also.
Yes.
And the Ashtoreth, which was Astarte in the Greek religion, the Ashtoreth poles, put away your Ashtoreth poles. Ashtoreth was seen as a wife of El, also back in the day. And some scholars theorize that the worship of Ashtoreth would have led into Israelite religion, as if Israel was trying to equate Yahweh with El, the supreme God.
Yeah, I read this.
That Ashtoreth was married, then they would have confused it and said Ashtoreth was married to Yahweh, which was completely blasphemous and would have been one of the things that would have made God upset as idolatrous in the Old Testament. So just some history of some of the interplay of gods going on in this region and why it was so destructive for Israel not to clear the land like God instructed in Joshua, and why the surrounding polytheistic religions was so pernicious into the daily life of Israel. As we get into chapter 5, God is literally doing battle with the god Dagon in his temple here. And so first, just reading here in verse 2 of chapter 5, then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. I love the very literal physical references here.
It's almost like he was bringing this box of to literally like, oh, here's your sacrifice.
Yes.
Like, it's like almost like they're sacrificing this. We made the sacrifice for you. We're bringing it to you.
Yep, to Dagon.
To Dagon, yeah.
Picking up at verse 3, and when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and stood him back up.
Yeah. So when he fell on his face in the spiritual realm, or what would they have immediately known that being?
Yeah, like subservience, worship.
Worship.
If you're on your face, you're worshiping.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. So the first thing they notice is, oh my gosh, now it's like, oh wait, he looks like he's worshiping this little box. Remember this little bitty box? Remember this big stone?
Yep.
He's worshiping this little box. That's powerful. Yeah. And then, but it gets better, right?
Yeah,
it gets better.
Because they put him back up, and then the next morning they come up. Not only is he downward, but his head is decapitated and his hands are broken off. Yeah. And he's literally across the threshold of the temple.
Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah.
This is what...
and power back in that day came from the hands.
Right.
And his head is decapitated like he's disembodied now.
Yeah. I think what you are to imagine possibly is that these people would have arose and went into their temple and immediately known what that meant. Yeah. Because in that day and time, when you defeated a king or defeated another ruler, you would cut off their hands or their head, and then sometimes they'd even send them. They would either like put them up on a pole or they'd send them off somewhere, and so they immediately know in their culture when they would have saw that, they would have instantly known that means he'd been defeated.
Yep,
completely defeated.
And it's a physical sign that he's not coming back. So the new power, you better listen to him.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And then he goes on. To even do some more damage to them, to even prove even more who is this God.
Yeah. So
which reminds me of a point I was thinking when I was reading this. Israel, as a people, the reason they were set up was to let everyone know who the real God is.
Yep.
To know who He is and that He is the only God. And here you see God doing it for Himself. Right? Yeah. It's almost like it's all of a sudden God's like, if you're not going to do it, Israel, you're not doing it. I'm going to do it for myself.
Israel, you're not going to fulfill my calling. So
but His glory is still going to be done either way. He's still going to defeat these gods in either way.
And that's ultimately what He has to do through Christ, right?
I agree.
The humanity first, and then Israel specifically couldn't fulfill the call of God, so God had to step in and do it. He had to do it Himself for us,
right?
Which is completely incredible. And so even here we see the grace of God.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
So to even make it even further proof of who this God is, he has these plagues, Craig.
Right. So we got plagues again. Yep. Right. So we have plagues. So again, Dagon being the god of grain, we have mice coming in and destroying the crops.
Right.
Right. Well, secondly, Dagon was seen as also a fertility god. Right. And so
was his wife.
Yes. Ashtoreth. And so when we put that together, we get the Bible talks about these tumors is what the ESV translates it as. I think
sores is another way of describing.
I think it was in NIV said swellings. I could be wrong on that, but I do know one of the translations says swelling. So you get this sense of sores, tumors, or swellings. These bulges are appearing on their body. Well, what is that? there's this one scholar who, and he's more of an archaeologist, but he's also a biblical scholar, who wrote a article in Biblical Archaeology Review magazine a few years ago. His name is Aren Maeir, Maeir, and I'll link
We'll definitely
the article in the show notes if you want to do more research. It's very scholarly. I'm not going to try to decompose everything he says because it's way above my head, but just summarizing it, he basically, just cutting to the chase, and I'll give a little bit of a few supporting summary statements of why he thinks this, but he basically is saying that the original word here is ophalim. Their Hebrew word is ophalim. Ophalim is the version I saw of that. And what he's arguing it means is basically a swelling of the male member. And so without trying to get too graphic on a biblical podcast, you can imagine that would mess with the man's mojo and be a threat to his ability to be fertile, right?
Yeah, right.
And so between those two, God is attacking their source of life, the grain, and their source of life, their fertility,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That's great.
And their ability to procreate. So why does Maeir think that? So one, there was a tradition within the ancient Hebrew synagogue readings to substitute out graphic words, we'll say, and they wouldn't if that it meant what he thinks it meant. They wouldn't have wanted to read that in their public synagogue readings, right? So they replaced the word with tehorim, Tehorim, which is a modern Hebrew word for hemorrhoids. So that's one thing, but that word tehorim appears nowhere in the Bible. Mm-hmm. So kind of that on one side, and then Maeir believes that it doesn't make sense that in chapter 6, we'll see that they make golden images of the swellings or the tumors, along with the mice too.
Right.
It's basically their priests want them to represent the plague so that from the 5 cities, so they can send the plague out of Philistines.
Very pagan thing to do.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's what they're doing with this. They're making images. So Maeir's point is, why would they make images of tumors or weird swellings? But in digs, in various Philistine city digs and tells, we have seen molds, sculptures, artwork, golden images of the male member. And we even know this in Greek mythology and Greek culture, right? Yeah. We see sculptures. So putting all that together to say, and this gets more complicated than that, but these are some of the reasons why he wants to translate it along this way.
I think that's really interesting. You sent me that article, and I read part of it.
Yeah.
I didn't read all of it.
It's hard to read all of it.
It's very, like you said, scholarly.
Yeah.
I read part of it. It was very interesting. I think you should read it if you're more interested about this. What's up with these sores and things, these tumors. So it's really interesting. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. Some people think maybe it's the bubonic plague.
I did read that too.
Because bubonic plague comes from mice, and so the mice brought it in, and it was like they were connected.
It's definitely possible. Yeah.
So that's possible. I also noticed that it would be interesting for me if it was something that I call it the penis plague. I'm sorry.
I tried to avoid it. I tried. Not my fault. I tried.
I'm not PG. Okay, I have a hard time. I'm not correct in a lot of ways. That's just how God made me. Okay.
At least if anybody's wondering, they know what we're talking about.
Yeah. I
beat around the bush.
You did. I was helping out here. But anyways, I think if it was just affecting the male member, if you will, it may have said the men, but it talked about them, like them as in like everybody, all. Yeah. So maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We don't really know. But this article is very convincing. Like it has a lot of information about digs and archaeology, and it was very fascinating.
Yeah, I don't want to present this as an open and shut case. It's not, but I do find it very convincing as a possibility.
Yeah.
Because really, well, one, the archaeological evidence it fits well with, and two, just what God will be doing here.
Yeah, because we talked about he's always going against whatever the pagan god was for. So we've seen it before.
And if this is the interpretation, he's tackling the the power that this God is supposed to be over the grain and fertility.
Yeah, and we're going to see that again a little bit later in this chapter about another God that he's going to go against what he's known for. So we'll get to that soon. Craig's like, I don't even talk about.
Yeah, I don't.
Good. I can't wait to surprise you.
Let's get to it.
I don't get to surprise you very often.
You got to save some nuggets for real time.
That's right. Got to save them. So we get into part of chapter 6 is that they're like, we got us in this Yahweh back to their home. What's interesting, the reason I bring it up by saying Yahweh is because what's interesting is for the very first time in chapter 6, verse 2, it says, "And the Philistines called for their priests and for their diviners and said, 'What shall we do with this ark of the Lord?'" This is the first time since the book of Samuel started that they actually call it the book of the ark of Yahweh.
Interesting.
Instead of the God. What's fascinating is you see the Philistines, the ark has been in their presence for 7 months here in verse 1, and their theology is better than the Israelites, who has had hundreds of years.
250 years, I think you said they've been in the promised land.
At least in the promised land. But even before that, they've had their law. They've had a Levitical system set up. They've had sacrifices. God's been in their presence. I mean, they've been following pillars of fire and cloud. And their theology has been so warped. In 7 months, the ark is in their presence. And they already call it the ark of Yahweh when Israel is not.
That's interesting.
It's so interesting. But they want to send it back. Like, what do we do? So they send it back. They sent it back, but they didn't send it back immediately. They did one more test. Did you catch the test, Craig?
I don't know, something about cows and they wanted the heifers to kind of be yoked together and to go towards the path. They were like, if this is of Yahweh, it'll follow the path. It'll take it back.
Which is so interesting. They basically one last test. Like if this really is Yahweh, and then they basically made it impossible for it to go back to Israelite country.
Right.
Because what's interesting, I actually grew up in the country on a farm life, and so I dated some FFA guys in my day. I was not an FFA myself, but
that's a callback.
Yeah,
I haven't heard that in a while.
I know, right? So I've learned some things when I was from Missouri. So the cows, first of all, you would never yoke milking cows ever. Like they just do not work together. They're going to do their own thing, right? Yeah. So number one, it would be out of their nature and character to work together to go in a straight line. We see that they never turned left, they never turned right. Wow. They only went the narrow way, which I think points specifically to the narrow way. Once again, we had the narrow way first show up in the Exodus story when they're crossing the sea. Yeah. It talks about this is the narrow way. And I think this is very similar language. And then secondly, especially that these ones, not only were they milking cows, but they also had calves, and they left the calves behind. Never. Yeah,
cows wouldn't leave their young.
They would not leave their young, right? Yeah. And so they would immediately come back. Thirdly, that's out of their nature. Thirdly, if you take a domesticated animal, like a cow or something like that, and you take them into a different new territory, they will find their way back to their old territory. That's what they do. That's just instinctually in them. Go back home. They do not go back home, right? And then not only that, so all the things, the Philistines are like, we're going to make this impossible, so if it happens, we know this was not by accident.
Because literally, for it to happen, the cows had to go against their nature.
In so many ways, right? Multiple ways, which is really, really interesting. And not only that, but it ends up in a town that is a Levitical town. It was a town that was a refuge city set up. Yeah. And so not only did they go straight, and they did not turn around, and they didn't go back to their calf. And not only did they work together, but they end up straight outside of a refuge city, which is full of Levites.
Yeah, verse 19, Beth Shemesh. Yeah. Beth Shemesh. Easy for me to say.
Do you want to say that one more time?
Yeah, probably not.
They end up there. And so not only the ark ends up going somewhere that they should know how to take care of the ark and take good care of it. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
And what happens, they look on it wrong, and they're obviously going against the Levitical code here.
They do.
They're Israelites. And it's Levitical town, to your point. They have the Levitical code to know how to approach God, God's ark.
And they are not humble enough. Right. And they become curious, and they look inside, and a whole bunch of people die because of it. But none of the Philistines died because of the mishandling of the ark here. What's up with that?
That's kind of interesting, isn't it, right? God seems to be judging each group of people based on what they know. Yeah. And so, again, this is a grace of God, but also, remember, we have a God who is just and a God of judgment and justice. Yeah. And if you violate the law that that He's revealed to you, He's going to hold you accountable.
I think you're exactly right. It's about the revealing. Yeah. So the Philistines do a lot of things that if an Israelite done, especially a priest or a Levite, they would have been struck down immediately. But he doesn't here. He allows them to put the ark on a cart. You're not supposed to put an ark on the cart. You see David do it. Ark on the cart. Yeah. You see David do it later, and send it to Jerusalem, and a whole bunch of people die. Yeah. And later in the story, in 2 Samuel, I believe, that happens. But anyways, here he allows it, and he almost accepts their offering, which is not the right kind of offering. Why? Well, because they didn't know the Levitical law. He's judging them by their heart. They're judging them by they almost repent. It says they have a guilt offering. It's almost like a repentive heart, and God is a just God, but he's just enough to judge you based on what he has already revealed to you. So be careful as Christians. We are not judged the same because we have this and we believe in this.
To whom much is given, much is required.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Let's move on before we get too talkity. Chapters 7 and 8. Should we kind of put these together? Oh, just 7.
Yeah, just kind of wrapping 7. Mm-hmm. Well, the story for the ark kind of ends in 7, 1, and 2 because it ends up in a Israelite city, Kiriath Jearim, and it's an Israelite city, but it's another Levitical city, which seems to handle it better because it stays there for 20 years.
Yes, they do. So just above. The people from Beth Shemesh asked the question in verse 19, 20. In verse 20, it says, "Who is able to stand before the Lord? This is the holy God." And the answer sort of is nobody, but some. Yeah, but yes, some. Yes. And we see immediately some can because they are humble enough to treat it properly.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of in one hand, no one can ultimately. But if you are humble enough to do it right in the way that God has set up, then yes.
I mean, that's what the entire book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy is really set up to be. It's teaching Israel how to approach a holy God. Yeah. And they've been stepping on that for dozens of years since at least Samson and probably a couple of judges before that. And we saw even after Samson, the Levitical priests that we saw were serving themselves, including Eli. And so they've totally forgotten. So no wonder they're reaping the consequences of that.
So the people of Israel finally want to truly turn. Samuel, how do we actually turn and go back to the Lord? And he says, it's simple. All you have to do is finally put away all your foreign gods and your Asherahs. Yep. And he talks about, so the people of Israel put away their Baals and their Asherahs. And then later they come out and Philistines come to fight them. And for the first time, they don't go to their magical box that they want to rub. They tell Samuel to pray to Yahweh. So they finally are getting it. Yep. And what does Yahweh do? They show up through what? It says through thunder. Remember who Baal was?
God of thunder.
The storm god. Storm. Right. So here we are again. We just mentioned Baal. Yeah. Put away your Baals. And immediately when the Philistines, who still worship Baal, come to take Israel, this is my wow moment. This is why I didn't pre-talk you. Yeah. Then he comes like thunder, which is exactly against Baal, which is so cool.
So even that, whatever God he faces, he's going to beat them at their own game on their own turf.
Exactly it. Literally. It's so awesome.
And so what struck me about this passage is a couple things. One is compared to the Israelites' battle against the Philistines in chapter 4, completely different outcome, right? They wanted to rub their magical box to use your illusion in chapter 4, and they got defeated, and the magical box was taken from them. Yeah. Here, they pray to God. Yeah. They repented, which, by the way, repentance includes turning away from the way you used to do things. Exactly. Right? Turning and walking.
It's not just I'm sorry. It's not just my bad.
It's you're implementing the new way of life, the new believing loyalty that you have towards God. Yeah. And they literally put away the Baals and the Asherahs, verse 4 of chapter 7. So the people of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtoreth, and they served the Lord only. Right? Yeah. So they're all this together, put together, we have a completely different outcome of the battle of Israel against the Philistines. So much so that by the end of chapter 7, they drive the Philistines completely out of Israelite territory, reclaim all of the Israelite cities that the Philistines had taken. And we'll see Saul and David continuing to fight the Philistines, but the Philistines are no longer an existential threat invading the promised land. Right. They're on the fringes, they're on the outskirts territory and the borderlands of Israel, and those are the fights they have, and Israel will even at some point invade Philistine land. but no longer is Israel itself threatened.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I noticed in the battle as well is that it talked about when the Lord came as thunder, mighty sound, that day against the Philistines, and he threw them into confusion. This threw them in confusion is something I feel like God has done multiple times. The first time I noticed it was back when Pharaoh's chariots were following them over the and it said it caused them into a panic.
Wow.
Remember that?
Yep.
It's the same word. It can be translated as panic or confusion.
Nice.
And it basically there's this idea where it forces them to turn and run away. Remember, they're like, oh gosh, panic and run, right? And they turn, and then the water takes them on.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. This is the same way that God has shown up throughout the Judges. I looked it back up, and when Barak decided to finally, go into battle despite him wanting to not do it alone, he finally goes out to battle. What happens, right? God has them run away, and they defeat them from behind, right? Same thing with Gideon. Gideon stops dragging his feet, stops testing the Lord, finally goes to battle, right? They're frightened, they're built into confusion. They run away, and he gets them from behind. It's never a frontal attack. Have you noticed this? Over and over again, anytime that God helps Israel fight their enemy, it's never a frontal attack. Yeah. They always seem, and sometimes I remember in one of the stories, maybe it's Jephthah, one of the stories, they actually fought each other and Israel didn't do anything. Remember they killed each other?
Yeah.
It's interesting how God is doing that.
And I kind of wonder, I've talked about this a few times, if Israel had followed God faithfully as they entered the promised land to take it.
Yeah.
And they didn't really follow the heart of God to follow his instructions. They fought the Canaanites on their own terms. They fought them militarily.
They did.
And if they had followed God, it probably would have looked more like this.
I think you were. I think that's certain based on what I've been looking at. And I also noticed that shortly after this whole them running away, it says there was peace. I was like, I haven't seen that word for a long time.
That's true.
Remember how we kept talking about there's peace among the land?
Yep.
We haven't seen that. I haven't seen that word in a long time.
Peace has been strangely absent from the story.
It sure has, and here it shows up. So now that they're at peace, and Samuel's doing a great job being a prophet and a judge now. Yeah. He's kind of being a mobile judge. He's going from place to place. We've never seen that before.
Yeah,
every judge has been in one place.
Yep.
He's sort of kind of moving, bouncing around, judging from place to place.
He's even got an annual circuit, it says.
Yeah, which is fascinating and different. He's a prophet and a judge, and he's kind of moving around, right? Prophets seem to come and go.
Yep.
Here he's kind of traveling, doing his thing. But then the people think, but you're not doing enough. You're getting old. So we want a king.
You old?
Yold.
You old?
Yold. Remember that from last time? Yeah, you remembered that.
Yeah, I did.
I wrote it down and you remembered it.
Well, you said it for Moses, I think, right?
No, it wasn't Moses.
God tells Moses, you old? Who was it?
It wasn't Moses. It was like Gideon or something. You old.
I don't know.
I'm going to look
back
as
and
you.
Find that episode.
I'm looking at it right now because I'm pretty sure it's in Judges. And you can talk about Israel wanting a king.
Yeah.
And is God anti-king or is he pro-king? We have a lot to say about this.
It's confusing, right? Because, that's a great question. Mm-hmm. As we get into chapter 8, Israel demands a king. And, Samuel's getting old, like we just said. His sons are judges over Israel, it says in verse 1. But they're not doing good. They're perverting justice and taking bribes, according to verse 3 in the ESV. So then this picking up in verse 4, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations.
Your sons don't. Your sons are acting wicked. Who does that remind you of? Eli.
Oh, yes.
But
and his sons.
That's what I'm saying. Eli and his sons. But what's interesting is Eli gets kind of judged based on his son's wickedness because of his lack of, right?
Yeah.
Maybe judgment towards his own sons or help them to not be in sin. Here, you don't see that at all, but it's interesting. It's kind of comparable. If you think about it, it's kind of comparing these two. Remember you said the contrasting households?
Yeah.
You see it here again, I think.
It's interesting. God is the one, through the prophet and through Samuel, God is the one that comes to Eli and condemns them. Here it's the people coming to Samuel condemning them.
Yeah, right.
It's just kind of an interesting flip.
It is.
So anyway, that sets up Israel's request for a king. And in this request, they even use language of their king that should be reserved to Yahweh. In verse 20, it says, but there should be there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. That go out before us and fight our battles is God language. That's the place reserved for God, for Yahweh, to lead Israel out in the battles, as we've been talking about. And they want to pervert that position and give it to a human king.
Yeah, I wrote down the same thought. I highlighted that as well, and I said, there it is. There's the root reason why they want a human king. It's because they're scared of their enemies and they don't trust God enough to fight them.
Absolutely. So I think this is the kernel of the answer of your original question as we came in chapter 8. Throughout the Old Testament so far, I don't remember any negative talk about the king at all so far. And in fact, he set the king up in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20.
Yeah.
He sets up the laws and the rules for the kings.
What it should look like.
Very positive, how it should look like, right? And it's very prescriptive in a good way. And it sets up a king that is going to lead Israel in its best interest, but listening to Yahweh.
And it's a human king that he's talking about, right?
Absolutely.
It's a very specific human king. So what you're saying is not offensive that they want a leader.
Right.
That's not offensive. And he's not offended by the fact that they want a leader.
Exactly.
I think what he's offended by is they want to set up a leader on their own terms.
Yes.
They want to appoint it themselves. That's the big thing in Deuteronomy, is that it's appointed by God.
Right.
They're wanting to appoint it themselves. Actually, they're asking Samuel to appoint him.
Yes.
And then only that, but they're wanting a king like all the other nations.
Yeah.
That's the problem, right? In fact,
and Israel is supposed to be separate from the nations and apart to show Yahweh.
Right. And not only that, but I actually remember back in Genesis was the first time the word king, or the idea that God would set up a king at some point, actually in Genesis. Back in Genesis 17, when Abraham and Sarah's covenant, right after that, he promises Abraham that they are going to bear a son. And first of all, he's going to say, don't call her Sarai anymore, call her Sarah. And she's going to have a son. And he says this about him. He says, I will give you a son by her, and I will bless her, and she will become nations, kings of people shall come from her.
Wow.
So it's a promise way back then, that in Deuteronomy he said, okay, I promised it. Here's how it's going to be set up. It's on my terms, with a person that's humble, who trusts me, that I'm going to do the fighting for them, right?
That's awesome.
And then you see a group of people here who's like, yeah, maybe, but I want to do it. I want it to be like everyone else.
Theologian, biblical scholar Michael Heiser has a podcast on this, and that we can link from his Naked Bible podcast series. He talks about this chapter, and he even calls out the kings of Hezekiah and Josiah that are the only two good kings that are called out between all of First and Second Kings. It lists all of the kings of Israel's history. Those are the only two that these were good kings, right? Yeah. And they were committed to Yahweh, heart, mind, soul, right? And it repeats the sense of the Shema. Yeah. The Lord, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one.
They're Shema kings.
And love your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and might. And so this just reinforces the fact that the Bible didn't have a problem with kings. God wants the right kind of king who will follow him and represent Israel as his people. And my last, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the word here, O Israel, Shema kings, the word obey is actually not in the Hebrew language. The word obey actually is the word to hear. And so when I heard you just say is that a Shema king is the one who obeys Yahweh first.
Absolutely.
That's what I just heard you say.
I didn't know I said that, because that was much better than what I just said, I think, in my head. Anyway.
That's so great. Shema kings. I love it.
The last thing I want to say is theologian Gerald Eddie Gerbrandt has a book called The Kingship According to Deuteronomistic History. And I want to quote this because he has a thesis that summarizes this point nicely, and then we can move on. And he agrees with us that, or maybe we agree with him. I think it's more the latter.
Yeah, he might have done his work first.
Yeah, right. That Israel's sin was asking for a king on their terms instead of God's terms. Right. And so here's his quote. To lead Israel by being the covenant administrator, then he could trust Yahweh to deliver. At the heart of the covenant was Israel's obligation to be totally loyal to Yahweh. The godly king was to lead Israel in worship, keeping covenant, and trust in Yahweh to fight battles. So that's kind of wrapping things up. That's the kind of king they should have been looking for, and that's the kind of king we should look for. throughout the pages of the Old Testament, but it's also the kind of king that we get in Jesus.
That's awesome. I love that. I actually have two more quick thoughts, and we'll move into the New Testament.
Sounds good.
I'm going to wrap up the Old Testament by two comments. One, they were asking for a king like the other nations, so that God's going to give them like a king like the other nations.
Yeah,
and if you notice in this little paragraph from 10 through 18, it says the word take 6 times, not 7 times. 6 times it says he's going to take. He's going to take your wives. He's going to take your slaves. He's going to take your land. He's going to take.
Because Samuel's warning them what they have to face.
And then the very next we enter Saul. They basically asked, and that's what they're going to receive.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I was going to say is, remember at the beginning of chapter 8, the reason this whole kingship's coming up is because the people think that Samuel is no longer useful because of his age.
Oh, that's a good point.
Right? That's what the people thought.
Yeah.
If you pay attention, we're going to see Samuel actively doing the work of God for 20 plus more years.
Oh, wow.
Not only that, he's actually going to defeat another invasion coming up shortly as you read through First Samuel. So for 20 more years, he's not old in God's standards.
Yeah.
The people saw it wrong.
We just see God continue to subvert human wisdom and turning it on his head. Human wisdom is not God's wisdom.
Absolutely. So with that note, we will go talk about that Jesus king that you were just referring to.
Actually, I said there was, and so in John 6, I actually said there were 60 verses. There's actually 71 verses in John 6, so it's even longer than I remembered. So there's so much stuff here, but, we're a lot of minutes into our podcast here, so maybe I'll just try to summarize some points that might be interesting. So you can try to keep us to 10 minutes or so on this. But,
okay. I want to start giving you hand signals when we get too close.
The 4, 3. But we start out in chapter 6 with the story that's in all the synoptic gospels. It's in all 4 gospels. The feeding of
There's
the 5,000.
very few that are in all 4 gospels.
There are.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of them, the feeding of the 5,000. But there's a few differences which are interesting. And I think it's in these differences that we find our most salient points. And maybe it's even what John was riffing off the other Gospels that were already out, because we don't think that John was the first Gospel. So I'd say I think John is on purpose changing some of the details for theological revelation of Jesus and who Jesus is. So one of the things that we have here is that immediately in verse 1, after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And the other feeding of the 5,000, he's on this side of the Galilee. And what's on this side of the Galilee? What's on this side of the Galilee and what's on that side of the Galilee?
Gentiles versus Jews?
Spot on. On this side...
I was nervous for a second.
I didn't give you a
Bible trivia
on that one.
I know, I was like,
On this side of the Galilee, we have Capernaum and a couple other Jewish cities. I called it the Triangle, right? And then on the other side, we have the Decapolis, which is a very Roman area, very Gentile area. So he's literally going to the other side into Gentile area to feed the 5,000. That's one change. Another change is in verse 13 before I get there, a second difference I noticed was he's calling out Philip directly. Right? He's challenging Philip. Where are we to buy bread so that we can feed these people? In verse 5, Philip isn't called out in the other.
It says the disciples.
It just says the disciples.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something interesting there that Philip is being called out. I read that this Philip was a pastor of a neighboring province to John, that we think wrote the Gospel of John, the disciple John. John was a pastor of Asia. John that wrote Gospel of John and the letters of John and the Revelation was a pastor of Asia in the second half of the 1st century A.D. And we think that Philip was somebody who would have been a neighboring pastor historically. So
I love when your history glasses come out.
It's like my superpower.
It is.
But then we get into verse 13 of chapter 6, like I was saying before, where we get barley loaves as part of the food that is going to kind of maybe seed the replicative food that they're going to feed the 5,000 with. And so all throughout this story...
Versus just like bread and fish.
Bread and fish,
right,
exactly.
It is specifically barley loaves. Yeah. And it makes that extra point.
And it's interesting because we get such Exodus language throughout not only chapter 6 here, but he's going to the other side of the sea. And in a minute, we'll see that he's walking on
the other
water.
side of the what?
The sea.
The sea.
Right?
Oh,
Yeah,
got it.
sea.
Like Exodus,
Yes.
Red Sea crossing.
Yes. Crossing the chaos, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what we're going to see in verses 16 through 21, which is the second story, Jesus is walking on water going back to Capernaum. I mean, it says he's started across the sea to Capernaum in verse 17, so we know he's going back to Capernaum, right? So, and that's another sense of Exodus that I'll get more into in a minute. But as we're talking about barley loaves, we've got these obvious Exodus themes playing all throughout the first 6.5 chapters of John here. But barley loaves isn't in Exodus. So where is that from? Now, I owe this to Marty Solomon again on Bema. He's got some brilliant insights, as always, but especially, even in John, I'll say, because he's got brilliant insights everywhere. But the barley loaves are unique here, but they also appear in the Old Testament. And where do they appear? They appear in 2 Kings chapter 4 with the story of Elisha when he feeds the 100.
Okay. So another feeding story. Yeah,
another feeding story. So I think Marty Solomon and Bema wasn't exactly sure what the tie was there.
Right.
You know, it's always important not to manufacture connections or lessons where we aren't sure. We only want to tie we want to connect dots that we're only sure that should be connected.
Yeah.
But there's some connection going on with barley loaves being here with the feeding, and barley loaves being in 2 Kings 4 with a feeding.
Yeah, I can see that.
We just may need to tease that out and think about it more about what the connection should be.
Yeah, so what I think I hear you saying is that John is making a few little shifts in his language when he's telling the story, not because the other synoptic gospels are wrong or that John is telling it differently. Remember, John's focus is not a exact itinerary of Jesus. He is making big theological statements about who Jesus is. And so he's making these little shifts where he's like, oh, as a Jewish person or someone who has been a meditator of the word, when they hear these little things, they would make connections immediately that we have to really work for. And so he's probably making some sort of statement about Jesus here over and beyond what the other gospels are saying, even if we can't pick them up easily.
Well, I wonder if there's something going on with it being in a Gentile territory also.
Yeah.
When it was in the triangle before of the Jewish, and really that was a Pharisaical kind of center of power there. If he's feeding 5,000, he's talking about 5,000 people, seven piece. I think it's 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish, so you got seven which total. Is completeness. And if he's kind of giving out what he's giving out, there's enough, right?
Yeah.
There's enough. If you trust me, there's always going to be enough.
Over in abundance,
and I will feed you, right? And,
provision.
And that would have been a very Jewish way of seeing it.
Yeah.
Here, we should put on Gentile glasses, $10 glasses, and see it from a Gentile perspective. And I haven't done that work, so maybe there's something there.
Interesting. But the people who John is writing to may have picked it up a lot easier.
Yeah. Because I've talked about before how he's kind of double language here. There's double entendre. He's speaking with the same language. He's speaking to a Jewish audience, and he's also speaking to a Gentile audience. And they would have picked up various aspects.
I love it. So great. Let's move forward.
So as I said before, Jesus walks back after the feeding of the 5,000 on the water, and he's going back to Capernaum. Again, insight to credit to Marty Solomon. He wonders if Jesus going back to Capernaum and the crowds want to follow him, because the crowds look for him the next morning. They notice the boat's still there, but Jesus isn't there, so they chase him back.
Yeah.
And then they find him, and in verses 22 and following, they have this dialogue. They basically say, "Hey, where'd you go?" And
what happened to my all-you-can-eat buffet?
Yeah.
What happened to that? I want some more. Feed me some more.
That's what they want. So Marty is wondering if this is almost a reverse Exodus. They're willing to go back to Egypt to get the bread, because that's what the Israelites in the wilderness had to learn.
They did. And there was several times they were like, "Hey, Moses, what'd you do? Bring us out here to kill us? Tell your Yahweh we want to go back to Egypt." Remember, several times through the wilderness that happened. And they're grumbly. And we're going to see the word grumble here in this story.
And that was actually one I was thinking of. Verse 43, Jesus said to them, "Do not grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day." So to your point, the Israelites were grumbling in the wilderness,
Yeah.
and they had just left Egypt, and they were complaining about having to hear the word of God.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, where can we get some of that great meat from Egypt?
Right. It's almost like they view the place that they just came from, they just got exodus from, as paradise.
Yes.
It's the wrong paradise. I'm thinking of the garden.
Yeah.
Like they've misunderstood where real paradise is.
Egypt to them was paradise.
Yeah.
Coming out of Exodus, we saw that all through.
And
Exodus.
here we almost see like Capernaum
Yeah.
as being.
And so they want to go back to the ways of the law,
Yeah.
right? The ways of finding comfort in Torah and who they were as God's people.
Yeah.
But Jesus has John spent all of chapter 1. Jesus, in his conversation with Nicodemus, talked about being born again of the Spirit, and
Right.
the Spirit goes where it will. And so we're getting this sense of spirit life.
Yeah.
And Jesus may be trying to call them to that.
Yeah.
And the people want to go back to law, kind of a religious exodus religious Egypt, if you will.
Yeah. I have one more thing for you.
All right.
You need to point out, even if it's quickly, we have 2 more miracles that we need to add up our
we do.
moving on up.
Moving on
We got 2.
We get-
And then I need you to mention our first I am statement.
Okay.
Even if we don't go into it deeply, can you just mention them for
Yeah.
us so we can get that started?
Yep, we'll do. So, to your point, we have 2 more of the 7 signs that Jesus performs in the Gospel of John, and we just covered them. The feeding the 5,000 is the 4th sign, and verses 1 through 15 of chapter 6. I've said that the feeding of the multitude is God has control over large quantities of food that He created.
The Word.
Right. This is the Word covering food and sustenance and feeding us. Right.
Yeah.
We talked about even back in Exodus how we thought Jesus was the manna
we talked
from
about
heaven, and the New Testament talks about that in the epistles, and so that's an obvious correlation that John wants us to make. The second or the 5th sign, and the second one of today, is in verses 16 through 21. We just covered Jesus walking on the water, and this is Jesus is controlling the chaos. He's bringing order to chaos, but literally he's word walking on water. He's word over nature.
Yeah.
So and then also you just pointed out, we have the first of 7 I am statements that John has Jesus say, right? I am the bread of life, and that is in verse 35, 48, and 51 of this chapter. This is the first of 7 I am statements. We'll have the other I am statements through the rest of John, and I'll post a link that has them listed out. But there's also a ESV chart, study Bible chart that's pretty helpful that we can go ahead and post also that shows the rest of the 7 signs or 7 I am statements. Since we won't get to some of these in our own summer break here, so but again, John is giving these packages of 7 because he wants to show completely, holistically, who Jesus is.
Yeah, so good.
And it's the obvious tie of I am. Jesus is claiming the same name that God gives Himself in the Exodus burning bush story to Moses.
Yeah, so good. Thank you, Craig.
You're welcome.
I love it. It's a lot, and you didn't even go into detail on those. There's a lot there.
Very surface level.
So read them. Study them. Don't just read over them. And I've heard this before. Yeah. I know the I am statements. There's so much beauty in them. And I was reminded, sorry.
No, I was going to say that for those of you who say that or things like that, I know the I am statements. Challenge yourself. Do you really know them? You probably don't. Yeah. Right.
I'm going to wrap it up this way.
Yeah.
I'm reminded as I think about our stories that we've been reading and as Jesus' I am statements are starting to come about in these John, I'm reminded that the I am statements of Jesus, and Jesus is the Word, and the Word has been there from the beginning, is that this God that we see through the Old Testament that we've been studying for 1.5 years together, the God of Moses, the God of Jacob, the God who shows up as manna, all these I am statements that we're going to see, the powerful thing that we keep seeing God in the Old Testament is the same God today.
Amen.
Same God. So when we see Israel cry out to God and say, God, please help us because the Philistines are up against us, trials are up against us, this thing that feels overwhelming in my life is up against me, and you cry out to Yahweh, not because He's a genie who you can rub and wish him upon you, because you humbly turn to him, knowing that he's going to fight for you. He's going to hear your cries. They heard it then. He will hear it now. He's the same God today. And as we read through these, just remember that it's just as powerful to kind of stick my nose into here, right? And to kind of get nerdy about what we talk about. But ultimately, as we talk about them, I want to remind you that this is the same God that we worship today. And he is just as powerful. He can heal us. He hears our cries. And just as we move into the summer, and I want to miss these little moments with you this summer, don't forget those things. I hope you are encouraged. I hope you too don't feel maybe the like, oh crap, I'm behind. Maybe this can be a moment to feel like you're getting caught up, even as we take a breath. And we cannot wait to meet you back in August.
Sounds good.
All
Hope
right.
you have a great summer.
See you then.
All right, bye.